Hello, everyone. This YouTube video is going to do two things. So the first thing this YouTube video is going to do is it's going to help you review for the Unit 1 essay test, which is going to be tomorrow, Wednesday, September 9th, which we'll be completing in class. The topic of the Unit 1 essay test is going to be federalism. I'm going to run through a essay prompt and show you the different points on the rubric that you need to be aware of. The second thing this essay or this video is going to do is it's going to talk a little bit about this thing that we didn't have enough time in class to discuss, which is this point on the essay rubric called refutation, or providing an alternative perspective. So you do get points for providing alternative perspective and either conceding or refuting or rebutting that perspective. We'll talk a little bit more about that using the Frum article that we will be reading in class on Thursday. You'll have an independent practice attached to the Frum article, which I'll discuss a little bit about here in this YouTube video to actually help you out on that independent practice on Thursday. So that will be the second half of the YouTube video. Well, I don't know if it'll be clearly delineated in halves, but maybe, maybe not. I don't know. I'm just going to wing it. So to help you out, your essay topic tomorrow is going to be on federalism. So you should definitely look at the previous YouTube video or previous lectures or notes that you've taken on federalism itself. Remember, federalism describes the relationship in our system of government, where the federal government and the state government share powers and responsibilities and even have distinct realms of powers and responsibilities. So this prompt itself is about a trend in federalism that we recognized when we did the defund or fund the police essays. But this idea that the federal government has been playing an increasing role. There's been a general trend of increasing power, increasing responsibilities of the federal government throughout the United States' history, especially in the 20th century. Of essentially the national government, encroaching upon the powers and the rights and responsibilities of the states, and being able to touch people's lives in that respect. So this is the prompt. Over time, the powers of the national government have increased relative to those of state governments. Develop an argument about whether the expanded powers of the national government benefits or hinders policymaking. Use at least one piece of evidence from one of the following foundational documents: the Articles of Confederation, Brutus No. 1, or Federalist No. 10. This is the thesis statement College Board came up with, because this is the old release prompt, and I will be trying to support that thesis statement. But again, this prompt is a little bit difficult because it says develop an argument whether the expanded powers of the national government benefits or hinders policymaking. So just that we're on the same page, hinders can be, prevents the effectiveness of, is an obstacle to, and policymaking, it's really hard to provide a definition of policymaking without including the term policy in it, but describes this idea that the government's ability to make policies, to impact our lives, to make laws, and to enforce those laws, etc. That's what we mean conventionally when we talk about policymaking. So already in this essay, there's different ways to go about this. Some of you might interpret this essay as an essay really about tyranny, and some of you may say that this is an essay about tyranny, that policymaking, this idea of benefiting policymaking should be policies that are not tyrannical, that are not abusive, etc. And you might see the increasing trend of national government power as potentially impeding or inhibiting or hindering abusive, tyrannical government, etc. So some of you may be focusing in that direction, maybe talking about tyrannical government, abusive government, etc. That's okay. You can also just talk about effectiveness of government, which is a little bit harder because I know a lot of us are not really well read in current events. Well, your AP government teacher is, but I know a lot of us meaning you, are not necessarily well read on current events, but you can certainly talk about policymaking from the perspective of, is the government too slow? Like, do things not move fast enough? Right? That's also another acceptable way to go about this essay. But I think based on what we discussed in Unit 1, it's probably more appropriate to go about this essay talking about this idea of, does this increasing power in the national government lend itself to abusive policies, tyrannical government, or does this increasing power in the national government lend itself to non-abusive power or non-abusive policies, non-tyrannical government? If I didn't make sense, then to add a layer of complexity, I am going to use the thesis statement that College Board gave because it blends the best of both worlds. Because this prompt is something I definitely didn't like, but it was on the College Board essay, or it was on the AP test. So I used at least one piece of evidence from one of the following foundational documents. So you can see here the Articles of Confederation, Brutus 1, the Federalist 10. I'm going to recommend that you just pick both on the essay test tomorrow. Pick 2 pieces of evidence from the list that they provided, because obviously we haven't gotten through all 9 foundational documents, but the only other foundational document that you would know of would be something like the Constitution or Federalist 70. But I would recommend picking 2 from the list provided. Thesis. So the thesis that I didn't come up with, that College Board did, but it says the expanded powers of the national government have made it more efficient. And if states had more power, it would be dangerous. Right? And so that's the trend, right? So this is the idea. This is more an essay modeled on like efficiency and less on abuse of power. This essay may focus on disorder, inequality if states have more powers than the national government, etc. That's what I envision this essay could focus on. I don't know yet because I haven't written it yet. So the evidence that I want to use, remember, you're going to use the name, describe, and explain how that piece of evidence supports the thesis statement, or your thesis statement. So I'll explain it in a bit. You're going to do this for 2 pieces of evidence. And remember, evidence is foundational documents. It can be concepts as well that we discuss in AP Government. But for right now, we're just going to use foundational documents in AP Government. Oftentimes, the prompt will restrict you. It'll tell you to use 1 piece of evidence from one of the following foundational documents. It might tell you to use, like, both pieces of evidence have to be from the list of foundational documents that it provides. It just depends, right? The only other foundational documents that you could use, though, are like the Constitution, and then you have to be specific about what in the Constitution, and then Federalist 70, which are the only other foundational documents that we've talked about. So you're going to do that for 2 pieces of evidence. I'm going to show you what I would do. So the first thing I know that could support my thesis statement, and I would imagine a kid that wrote this thesis statement would be thinking about this idea that the national government having more powers makes government more effective and efficient. And if states had more power, it would be dangerous, right? So you can see that there's a sort of claim and there's a because. This is actually a very thesis statement, but I included it because a student wrote it at one point in College Board. And so, okay, we'll take it. But how would I go about supporting this? So one thing that I think is going to be really effective, right? Because it seems that I am going to be talking about increasing power of the national government relative to state government. One piece of evidence I think will be really effective is the Articles of Confederation, right? And we can use the Articles of Confederation in a way and discuss the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation specifically. And the chaos engineered by Shays' Rebellion, and the disorder, etc., to kind of really attack and go at, or not attack, but to support this thesis statement, this idea that the national government should have more and increasing power, etc. And so the way I would do it is I would say the Articles of Confederation was, and then I described the document, was the first or organized United States government after the Revolutionary War. And I can get dramatic. It was a failure because a weak central government that could not tax or raise a standing army. The Articles of Confederation organized the United States government after the Revolutionary War. It was a failure because a weak central government that could not tax, could not raise a standing army, or did not have the Articles of Confederation, it was a failure because a weak central government that could not tax, could not raise a standing army, or did not have a strong executive to enforce laws. This led to disorder. In one example, Shays Rebellion, a group of rogue farmers this led to disorder. In one example, Shays Rebellion, a group of rogue farmers engendered chaos or created chaos. A weak national government was unable to establish order. Right, so this is a description of the piece of evidence itself, but the explanation on how it supports my thesis statement, that's a little bit harder and that takes a little bit more effort, but that's what you have to think about. So explanation always relates back to the thesis statements. You could say the failure of the Articles of Confederation reveals that increasing power, weak national government leads to inequalities across states that one state, for example, might not be enough to put down a rebellion. Sometimes the resources for one state, for example, might not be enough to put down a rebellion, or in modern context, we'll talk about Medicare and Medicaid later, provide health insurance for the poor in Medicaid. If you pull together the resources of the national government, or of the states through a national government, responses to crises won't be uneven. Right? So that's an explanation, so to speak. So we'll talk about Medicaid later. That's something that will come up later, but it's relevant too. So for example, I don't think like states like Mississippi, for instance, or Alabama, or what's another poor state? Kansas would be able to provide health insurance to their populations like Medicaid if it weren't for like the national government's ability to pull together everyone's resources and provide funding to essential programs, if that makes sense. Wait, is Medicaid funded? But I'll get back to you on how Medicaid is funded. I have to get back on that. But the national government is able to pull resources of richer states like California or Texas to provide social services for poorer states. You can imagine in a world where you have more powers and responsibilities reserved to states, you have more uneven responses, right? You might have lower capacity of states to put down something as dramatic as Shays' Rebellion, as in the Articles of Confederation, when Massachusetts really struggled to put down Shays' Rebellion. A national government really kind of pulls all these resources together from states that might have more money to kind of establish things that we might take for granted in today's context, like order or even health insurance or other things as well. We also talked about like inequalities across police departments within our talking about federalism, how different police departments, police departments are locally funded or funded by state and local governments, and how there might be inequalities across funding. Well, so in this perspective, you might see the benefit of like a national government increasing funding for underfunded police departments, and this brings it back to your defund or fund the police essay that we talked about last week. You can also imagine education spending too. We talked about how education spending is so unequal. That was the short answer question that was on your Unit 1 exam. But you can imagine too, like if the federal government has an increasing and larger role in education, they can potentially ameliorate some of those inequalities. And you might think of that as more effective and better government as well. So another piece of evidence that you could just name, describe, and explain. I'm probably not going to do this because I don't want this video to be too long, but you could do something like Federalist 10. You can name it, describe what's in Federalist 10. You could talk about how factions and Madison thought large national government reduced power of factions, etc. That this was good because removed ability for these factions to be tyrannical. And then you can apply it to this context. So this would be something that you're not necessarily talking about the efficiency. You're talking about how like a strong national government actually obviates, or that's a big word, but hinders tyrannical government, right? And we talked about this idea of Federalist number 10 within the context of Ruby Bridges, the Ruby Bridges example. So having a strong national government inhibits tyrannical government. So that would be something in your application that you would need to write about, and it probably needs to look something a little bit like this in this length, and explain how it supports this thesis statement. Providing an alternative perspective is the hard part, and it's what we did not get time to do in class today. I'm going to teach you how to refute an alternative perspective. We're going to use the word yet. This is super important because this tells me that you're really considering like what are some of the alternative arguments themselves to this essay. And so one of the things that I just really want to get across to you is that this point is really difficult to obtain or I'm sorry, it's really difficult for kids to not difficult to obtain, but kids sometimes struggle with this, but it's not difficult to obtain, right? It's actually a lot easier. And so one of the ways that I'm going to teach you how to do it is I'm going to teach you how to provide a claim for an alternative perspective, and then yet explain your position is better or whatever because, and elaborate. That's all you have to do. I know in a previous video I discussed that you might have to even use like another piece of evidence. I went back and checked. That was my mistake. You don't necessarily have to cite another piece of evidence. So for example, an alternative perspective that I imagine one can build an essay around might suggest that this strong national government and this trend to increasing power within the national government may lead to tyranny and ineffective government. You can use Brutus #1 to make that argument. How you would do that, remember Brutus #1 talks about how a large republic would not adequately represent the interests of so many different people. So in that vein, I'm going to be thinking about how Brutus #1 might respond to this thesis and to this trend specifically of increasing power in the national government itself. And that will be the claim. I'm going to provide a yet, and then I'm going to restate why what I think, or I'm going to say yet, kind of explain a little bit about why my thesis is stronger, and then elaborate a lot with the because. So let's see. So one point you can imagine is from a Brutus #1 perspective, you can start off by saying some may say that the trend of increasing power to the national government is concerning because the national government cannot effectively represent the interests and values, whatever, of people in the same way that state governments can. So this is a very much Brutus #1 argument. Remember in Brutus #1, he says that in a nation as big as 3 million people, because that's how big the United States was when he was writing, now it's about 330 million people, Mr. Diaz doesn't get his voice heard. He doesn't get his voice heard because if we have a huge national government with so many powers and responsibilities, Mr. Diaz's voice is a lot less important if there's a national government than if there's a lot of powers and responsibilities reserved for state and local governments. At the state and local level, Mr. Diaz gets his voice heard because by sheer numbers, he's a bigger portion of people that participate in that democracy, right? So that's the alternative perspective, right? You don't have to explain how Brutus #1 supports it. You can if you want, and in fact, I recommend that you do so. So the AP graders really kind of understand your logic if your language itself is a little bit off, but you don't really have to. But you definitely do need to refute it, right? So this is just an alternative thesis statement. You haven't refuted it yet. So this is how we'll do it. Yet, the national government state governments actions in state and local governments disproportionate power Yet factions in state and local governments can gain political power more easily when they are forced to compete at the national level. Remember, this is exactly what Madison said. Like, you would have more tyranny at the local level. And so in essence, you don't necessarily have to cite Brutus #1 or Federalist 10, but you are basically borrowing the arguments from Madison and David Yates, who wrote Brutus #1, and integrating it there. And then give me some explanation on why this is so. More ability. Yet, factions in state and local governments can gain political power more easily than when they are forced to compete at the national level. And factions have more power at the state government. Factions have more power in state governments than they do in large. Must compete with more factions to get what they want. I think by yet here too, this probably would be sufficient to like count as a point, but I'm going to describe a little bit more because I told you to like write a little bit more, only because I want you to get into this format of putting a yet and then a because and like elaborating a little bit about your perspective, because that's what's really going to get you the refutation point. So although it seems pretty clear to me that I'm like reiterating Madison's argument, I want to make it pretty clear to the reader. Factions have more power in state governments than they do at the larger national government, where they must compete with more factions to get what they want. Therefore, the national government is a trend of increasing power and responsibility in national government does a better job at preventing the tyranny of factions. You can also define factions itself. Remember, Madison says we're a world of petty, self-interested individuals. In smaller republics or smaller governments, factions have more power because they can align with certain people, and then they can more easily take control and make sure that their interests are reflected in government and stuff like that. So, pretty cool, pretty interesting perspective. This is all you would need to write. This would be a pretty good essay. Of course, you would need to change that a bit. Okay. Now for the second part of this YouTube video is going to be strictly reserved for talking about David Frum's argument and further digging deep into providing an alternative perspective and refutation. The first thing I will say is like one of the most beautiful quotes that I've ever come across. Well, actually, no, it's not, but it's a very good quote. Was written by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and he wrote it in an essay he published called The Crack Up, and when he was going a little bit crazy. But he said that the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. And so, you know, although we're all super passionate about the arguments that we're making in this class, it's AP Government and Politics, and we all have opinions about President Trump or President or former President Obama or Biden, or police brutality or police funding issues, etc. One of the most powerful things that we can do in AP government is to really kind of step in the shoes of other individuals, try to understand the logic of their arguments, and if we still don't like them, then by all means, dispel with them. And that's what refutation is. And that's a skill, right? And so hitherto, you guys have been focused a lot on writing essays with a thesis statement and supporting evidence. In AP Government 2, you also have to develop the skill of presenting an alternative perspective and then refuting it, which I did in the essay that I just showed you. This is going to be the paradeck that we're going to have on Thursday. So for the Frum argument itself, right, you're going to read Frum's wonderful essay, or some of you may not think it's so wonderful, called How to Build an Autocracy, which was published in 2017. David Frum is a Republican, as we talked about in class. He's a Republican that was President Bush's former speechwriter in 2001 and 2002. That writes this essay and raises concerns about what he perceives are some authoritarian tendencies of President Trump, right? And so it's very much an interesting essay. It's an interesting argument itself that he builds, because he basically, critiques the way he critiques the structure of our government itself. And he says, Frum has a lot of praise to have on this idea of separation of powers and checks and balances and all these wonderful things that so many of you have heard about. But then he has a lot of criticism, and says that our government system itself, however beautifully designed Madison thought it was, and the modifications and critiques of the anti-federalists, et cetera, got embedded in our system of government, that it still has vulnerabilities, and that it has vulnerabilities to what he sees as fundamentally linked to the office of the presidency and the character of who's in the presidency. So, dang, this is going to be awesome. I love the enthusiasm so far from my students in this article. So here you can see some of the definitions. I provide you definitions of words that are a little bit difficult for us to understand, and then I provide you links to articles. I'm sorry, guys. I have a subscription to the New York Times. I don't have a subscription to the Wall Street Journal. I wanted to include, but I did not provide links to any opinion articles. I think maybe only 2 or 3. Most of them are hard news reporting articles. I provided links to Lawfare blog, which is this great blog out of the Brookings Institution, which is the #1 think tank in the world, according to this this report compiled out of the University of Pennsylvania. It's a really good blog that has a lot of great legal analysis and stuff like that. And that's what you guys are in this class. You guys are a combination of both political scientists and lawyers, which are, that is the coolest thing ever. To be able to teach this class is the privilege. I am so in awe that this is my dream job. I'm so in awe that I am able to teach this class, that I'm able to say 10 years from now that I taught kids both law and politics. That's amazing to me. But anyways, I'm getting off topic. Law and political science. So I'm going to go ahead and read the excerpt that I'm going to have you read. If you want to skip ahead, there will be a timestamp where I can continue on the practice later. But I wanted to read it because I wanted to kind of ground us in Frum's argument and to kind of help you piece together what Frum's argument is too. So he starts off. The United States is, of course, a very robust democracy. Remember, you're reading page 7. You're not reading the whole thing. Robust means strong. Yet no human contrivance is as tamper-proof, a constitutional democracy least of all. Some features of the American system hugely inhibit the abuse of office, the separation of powers within the federal government, the division of responsibilities between the federal government and the states, federalism. Federal agencies pride themselves on their independence. The court system is huge, complex, and resistant to improper influence. You can see he uses a lot of AP government concepts that we've used in class. And he's also going to refute this argument, which is really, really cool. He's about to refute this argument that the United States is a very robust democracy that isn't prone to authoritarian practices. Yet, see how he uses yet? Oh my goodness, I couldn't have scripted it better myself. Yet the American system is also perforated by vulnerabilities no less dangerous for being so familiar. Supreme among these vulnerabilities is reliance on the personal qualities of the man or woman who wields the awesome powers of the presidency. A British Prime Minister can lose power in minutes if he or she forfeits the confidence of the majority in Parliament. It's true. The President of the United States, on the other hand, is restrained first and foremost by his own ethics and public spirit. Public spirit means his or her willingness to do stuff for the public good, not for their own interests. What happens if somebody comes to high office lacking those qualities? Over the past generations, we have seen ominous indicators of a breakdown of American political system. The willingness of congressional Republicans to push the United States to the brink of default on its national obligations in 2013 in order to score a point in budget negotiations, Barack Obama's assertion of a unilateral executive power to confer legal status upon millions of people illegally present in the United States, despite his own prior acknowledgement that no such power existed. So in there, he's talking about DACA. So you can kind of see that Frum has a conservative perspective on President Obama's use of executive power. Donald Trump, however, represents something much more radical. A president who plausibly owes his office, at least in part, to a clandestine intervention by a hostile foreign intelligence service. So in point 61, this footnote is really important. In 2017, the Central Intelligence Agency, the NSA, the FBI, and the Office of Director of National Intelligence concluded that Russia interfered in the 2016 election. The CIA and FBI claimed to have high confidence that Russia interfered to bolster Trump's election chances, while the NSA claims to have moderate confidence. In 2018, President Trump held a summit with President Vladimir Putin, where he publicly challenged the conclusion of his own intelligence agencies that Russia interfered in the 2016 election. Okay, and then it goes on. These footnotes are created by me. They're aimed to provide context. I know some of us in class have expressed this idea that they think, or I don't know what they mean by the Russia hoax, but I saw that on a Pear Deck. Yeah, but I will just say that there is a national intelligence estimate, which is a document that is supposed to compile the opinions and not the opinions, the perspectives of American intelligence agencies that concluded that Russia interfered in the 2016 election to bolster President Trump's election chances. I think what you mean by the Russia hoax is you're not convinced. Like, it would be interesting if you could come to office hours and explain that to me. I think you mean you're not convinced that there was collusion with President Trump and Russia, which Robert Mueller's report found that there was certainly things that are problematic, but he declined to charge the president and probably Donald Trump Jr. with, well, collusion is not a crime itself. I'm just going to zip it because I can't speak intelligently about this because I'm a little tired. But yeah, to push brink of default, Barack Obama's assertion of a unilateral, okay, who creates blind trusts that are not blind, invites his children to commingle private and public business. So to kind of, and somehow gets the unhappy members of his own political party either to endorse his choices or shrug them off. If this were happening in Honduras, we'd know what to call it. It's happening here instead, and so we are baffled. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. With those words written more than 200 years ago, the authors of the Federalist Papers explained the most important safeguard of the American constitutional system. Then they added this promise. In Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. So ambition must be made to counteract ambition. It's this beautiful quote from Federalist 70 describing how separation of powers and checks and balances are supposed to prevent tyranny or abuses of power. Congress enacts laws, appropriates funds, confirms the president's appointees. Congress can subpoena records, question officials, and even impeach them. Congress can protect the American system from an overbearing president, but will it? As politics has become polarized, so as the parties have drifted further and further apart, honestly, now it really just seems that people have become so polarized, they're living in like their own separate realities. Yeah, there's a lot of disinformation, guys. Stay on top of the news. Congress has increasingly become a check only on presidents of the opposite party. Recent presidents enjoying the same party majority in Congress, Barack Obama in 2009 and 2010, George W. Bush from 2003 through 2006, usually got their way. And congressional oversight might well be performed even less diligently during the Trump administration. The first reason to fear weak diligence is the oddly inverse relationship between President Trump and the congressional Republicans. In the ordinary course of events, it's the incoming president who burns with eager policy ideas. Consequently, it's the president who must adapt to and often overlook the petty human weaknesses and vices of members of Congress in order to advance his agenda. This time it will be Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House. Paul Ryan was the Republican Speaker of the House when President Trump was elected President of the United States. He eventually retired, I think in 2018, and then Democrats won the midterms. And so now Democrats control the House of Representatives. Republicans still control the Senate, doing the advancing and consequently the overlooking. Trump has scant interest in congressional Republicans' ideas, does not share their ideology. That's an interesting point, too. In 2004, Trump told Wolf Blitzer that he probably identified more as a Democrat and cares little for their fate. He can and would break faith with them in an instant to further his own interests. Yet there they are on the verge of achieving everything they have hoped to achieve for years, if not decades. They owe this chance solely to Trump's ability to deliver a crucial margin of votes in a handful of states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Trump, of course, won the Electoral College. Those states had conventionally gone Democrat, but for whatever reason, Hillary Clinton was not well received in those states, and she lost those states to President Trump, and she only lost them by a few thousand votes. So although President Trump didn't win the popular vote, he was, as this article suggests, able to give Republicans an advantage in these states that Republicans didn't have an advantage in before, which has provided a party that cannot win the national popular vote a fleeting opportunity to act as a decisive national majority. That's an interesting point because, as you can see here, twice in the past 5 presidential elections, a Republican has won the presidency despite losing the popular vote, and Republicans have lost the popular vote 6 out of 7 national presidential elections since 1992. The greatest risk to all their protests, projects, and plans is the very same X factor that gave them their opportunity, Donald Trump and his famously erratic personality. So what Frum is trying to get at here is that Trump's erratic personality, is an asset to voters. People certainly found Trump very appealing in that respect. There's tons of Trump supporters that are supportive of the president. They feel like he says it like it is, etc. Well, that same erratic personality Frum is arguing, that same I'm going to do it my way. I think he played that song, by the way, in his inauguration by, if you're a Frank Sinatra fan, My Way, that one. Yeah, he played it at his inauguration. That itself might land him in trouble. That's what Frum is arguing. What excites Trump is his approval rating, his wealth, his power. The day could come when those ends would be better served by jettisoning, giving up, the institutional Republican Party in favor of an ad hoc, so like kind of a makeshift populist coalition, joining nationalism to generous social spending. So that a mix that's worked well for authoritarians in places like Poland. So that nationalism part is really interesting because If you listen to President Trump's July 4th address at Mount Rushmore, a lot of critics said that he embraced a lot of white nationalist themes in that speech. He has people like Stephen Miller in the White House, who I believe has identified as a white nationalist. I might issue a correction in the description if I'm wrong. So just bear with me. I'm not too sure on that. But a lot of people said like his focus on like monuments and stuff like that, like Confederate monuments, like this is really just kind of like a white nationalist appeal, right? And so there's a link to a Washington Post analysis that you can read on that, etc. in the description. Like those are really not things that we should be focusing on. We should be focusing on COVID, I guess the critique goes, and he's really just appealing to this white grievance, etc. like that. That's one of the critiques of President Trump, for sure. And generous social spending. That's an interesting one because as your teachers probably could attest, the financial crisis of 2008 was massive. And so President Obama was elected right as the economy was falling apart, and he wanted to pass a $800 billion stimulus package. Actually, it was initially a $1 trillion stimulus package. Republicans pushed back on it because they were super concerned about the deficit and the national debt then. Well, recently, President Trump passed a $2 billion stimulus package with some of those same Republicans that were critical of President Obama and asking President Obama, how are you going to pay for it? They are now not as critical of President Trump. And actually, I saw Rand Paul, who's the Kentucky senator. He went on, I think it was Fox News, and he said, because he is one of the people that's holding up a second round of stimulus in the Senate, he said that Republicans should apologize. He's a Republican senator, to Barack Obama for giving him such a hassle about the deficit and debt. So who doubts Trump would do it? Not Paul Ryan, not Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader. For the first time since the administration of John Tyler in the 1840s, a majority in Congress must worry about their president defecting from them rather than the other way around. A scandal involving the president could likewise wreak havoc in the Republican congressional leaders have waited years to accomplish. However deftly they manage everything else, they cannot prevent such a scandal. But there is one thing they can do, their utmost not to find out about it. Do you have any concerns about Steve Bannon being in the White House? CNN's Jake Tapper asked Ryan in November. I don't know Steve Bannon, so I have no concerns, answered the speaker. I trust Donald's judgment. Steve Bannon, by the way, he's actually a Georgetown grad. He has the same degree that I do. He famously bragged that the news company that he used to manage, Breitbart News, was a platform for the alt-right. It's short for the alternative right, which is this loosely based connection, or actually not loosely based, but this connection of internet trolls and white nationalists just a collection of internet trolls and white nationalists. So some are concerned about him, or were concerned about him in being in the White House. He was on President Trump's campaign, and actually right now he's in a lot of big trouble. He's indicted for fraud, separate issue, but whatever. So a lot of people in early 2017 were concerned that Steve Bannon would be in the White House. Obviously, Paul Ryan is not. Asked on 60 Minutes whether he believed Donald Trump's claim that millions of illegal votes had been cast, Ryan answered, I don't know. I'm really not focused on these things. And so we talked about that extraordinary false claim that President Trump made, that millions of illegal votes had been cast, and that he actually won the national vote or the popular vote too, and not just the Electoral College. If that had been true, right, let's just process, like, guys, then we don't live in a democracy, because one of the cornerstones of democracy is the free and fair election. So if President Trump's claim that millions of illegal voters voted in the election, then that would warrant a massive investigation. Then we don't live in a democracy, right? That can't possibly be true. Well, he tweeted it out, and so obviously Paul Ryan is not concerned. I think he tweeted it out because he obviously was upset about people that were pointing out that he had lost the national popular vote. What about Trump's conflicts of interest? This is not what I'm concerned about in Congress, Ryan said on CNBC. Trump should handle his conflicts however he wants to. Ryan has learned his prudence the hard way. Following the airing of Trump's past comments caught on tape about his forceful sexual advances on women, Ryan said he'd no longer campaign for Trump. Ryan's net favorability rating among Republicans dropped by 28 points in less than 10 days. Once unassailable, meaning unattackable in the party, he suddenly found himself disliked by 45% of Republicans. As Ryan's cherished plans move closer and closer to presidential signature, Congress's subservience to the president will likely intensify. Whether it's allegations of Russian hacks of Democratic Party internal communications, or allegation of self-enrichment by the Trump family, or favorable treatment of Trump business associates, the Republican Congress and caucus in Congress will likely find itself conscripted into serving as Donald Trump's ethical bodyguard. The Senate historically has offered more scope to dissenters than the House. We discussed that the Senate has different term limits. They have 6-year term limits. Yet even the institution will find itself under pressure. 2 of the Senate's most important Republican Trump skeptics will be up for re-election in 2018, Arizona's Jeff Flake and Texas's Ted Cruz. They will not want to provoke a sane party president, especially not in a year when the president's party can afford to lose a seat or 2 in order to discipline dissenters. Mitch McConnell is an even more results-oriented politician than Paul Ryan, and his wife Elaine Chao has been offered a cabinet position, which might tilt him further in Trump's favor. Ambition will counteract ambition only until ambition discovers that conformity serves its goals better. At that time, Congress, the body expected to check presidential power, may become the president's most potent enabler. Wow, so those are really, really strong words said in 2017. That essay is like mind-bogglingly well written. I will say it's a very interesting argument that Frum presents. It seems too that we know that there's a lot of partisanship that exists. We discussed in class, differing perspectives about Republican Party elites on the rise of Trump in 2016 and how there was a lot of Republicans that were against his rise, etc. And it now seems that the Republican Party is pretty much, at least party members that are standing or want a future in the party are pretty much, that's their guy. That's who they're supporting, right? So how did we discern what is true? Well, that's up to you, right? That's up to you as a citizen, keeping watch, making sure you're vigilant about absorbing the news, etc. That's up to you. That's not something I can't make you care about these issues, right? I can only teach. But I want you to step in Frum's perspective, right? Because this is AP government. I want you to step in Frum's perspective, and I want you to think about how Frum might respond to this prompt, this essay prompt. Anti-Federalists were concerned about the creation of a strong executive under the Constitution. Were their concerns valid? Correct. And so I don't want you to go back into the essay and try to like pinpoint where and then like copy and paste it or rephrase it. No, I want you to absorb the totality of what you just read. Absorb the totality of what you just read. And then based on that, from here actually, what would Frum's thesis statement be? I'm not asking for your thesis statement. I know some of you hate Frum right now. You hate him. That's okay. You can tell me you hate him. Like after you submit this assignment, even within this assignment, after it, you put, Mr. Diaz, I hate Frum. That's okay. I just want, how would Frum respond to that prompt? And so you should have a claim with a because / a why. And I think it's pretty obvious that Frum seems to be in agreement with this idea. Anti-Federalists. This would be something Frum might write. Had a valid concern about the creation of a strong executive under the Constitution because vesting the power in a single person presents that individual with the unique opportunity. So Anti-Federalists had a valid concern about the creation of a strong executive under the Constitution because vesting the power in a single person gives that person a lot of response. Anti-Federalists had a valid concern about the creation of a strong executive under the Anti-Federalists had a valid concern about the creation of a strong executive under the Constitution because vesting the power in a single person gives that person a lot public visibility that can translate into composed of several members with different interests, difficult to check. Anti-Federalists had a valid concern about the creation of a strong executive under the Constitution because vesting the power in a single person gives it. All right, so the evidence that you could use, Frum himself uses Federalist 70. And so you can go ahead and use Federalist 70. You can use Brutus number 1 and Federalist 10. But remember, you're using the name, describe, and explain argument. So Frum uses Federalist 70, and Federalist 70 is supposed to say, look, we have these things like checks and balances and separation of powers, and the executive is good because a strong executive gets things done. Like a single power executive is good. That's in Federalist 70 as well. We don't want a small council of executives because then we can lead to like all kinds of deliberation, etc. Frum criticizes Federalist 70, right? He quotes ambition must be made to counteract ambition, and then he says later on, ambition will counteract ambition insofar as until it finds out that conformity serves its interests better, right? So he's very critical of separations of powers, etc. So you can use Federalist 70 and you can explain the weaknesses embedded within Federalist 70. An easier argument to make would be Brutus number 1, using Brutus number 1, talking about the critiques of Brutus number 1 of the executive, etc. That is made about a strong executive and the need to reserve more powers and responsibilities to state and local governments to prevent tyranny, etc. You could go that route. It's up to you. But just make sure that you explain and connect it to your thesis statement. Evidence number 2, you can paraphrase a piece of evidence found in the Frum article and explain how it supports the argument. So paraphrase any piece of evidence and just it could be from one of the footnotes, it could be one of those quotes from Paul Ryan, etc., and then explain how it supports Frum's argument, and then provide an alternative perspective and refute it. So for those of you that are like, super, I hate Frum, well, this is your chance. Provide what your alternative perspective would be, your alternative interpretation, etc., of this prompt. Or maybe that you really kind of share this view, right? You share this idea about the overbearing power of an executive, etc. Make sure you include like some information, the claim of the alternative perspective, and then after yet, you provide some kind of sense as to why that perspective is invalid, and then elaborate on that. That's what the because is for. So to encourage you guys to elaborate on that. All right, I hope this was a helpful video. Or let me actually just write it. So one perspective you can have, although some may claim that a strong president is more effective at getting stuff done and executing / enforcing the laws. That's one way you could spin it. You could also say, although some may claim checks and balances and separation of powers are enough to check the president. You don't have to include all though, right? Boom. Period. Yet, and then explain why your perspective is more correct. So I'm going to go with this one. Some may claim checks and balances and separations of powers are enough to check the president. Yet, in today's modern political environment where partisanship, excessive loyalty to a party dominates, checks and balances is rendered obsolete if the president is of the same party as Congress. And then the because is just to prompt you to kind of elaborate more on that. So elaborate a little bit more on that, and that would be okay. You don't necessarily have to use a because. Okay, that's all you have to do, my friends. Not hard.